Hey guys, this is Danny Boy. Today I have another build for you. This build is called the Headhunter, and it is essentially the spiritual successor to the Druid Hunter build from Diablo 2. If you are not familiar with the build or with the game, in Diablo 2 there was a Druid class. They had pets, bears, animals, wolves, crows, so on. So, a Hunter Druid used his pets as his primary means of damage, and supported them with a bow. Well, in this game, it's really not feasible to use your pets as a primary means of damage, so the goal of this build is to simply kind of have the spirit of the old Druid build, the old Hunter build, while still being viable, and at the very least, allowing you to use pets and to use them as tanks to an extent. So, rather than using a bow, because it doesn't make any difference for a witch doctor unless you're going to auto attack, which I'm not going to recommend to anybody, is to use the blow dart, the poison dart, and to use it with splinters. Splinters is by far the best choice. Numbing dart, the slow is too short. Spine dart I would only use if you need to get back mana for whatever reason, which isn't really necessary for this build. Flaming dart is out DPS by splinters, and snake to the face you could use in niche situations where you want to chain stun a boss or something, maybe in a party. There are certain bosses that are not immune to stuns. At least on the previous difficulties, I don't know about Inferno, but definitely splinters as your bread and butter. Unfortunately, poison dart rather, and splinters is one of the highest DPS combos of the witch doctor in general. Just spamming it, it has unlimited use. It will not actually use up your mana. You will regen mana far faster than you can use up the 10 it costs to spam this ability. So if you watch any of the streams when the Race to World First was on, basically all of the World First Witch Doctors were just spamming Poison Dart, which is unfortunate because Poison Dart and Splinters is one of the very first abilities and runes that you get in the entire game. So, kinda sucks as far as that goes, but in this build, it's thematic and makes sense to use anyway. So, Poison Dart, Splinters, and then, kind of in the spirit of using the Ravens from the previous game, the Crows, we're going to use Dire Bats from Fire Bats, and Dire Bats just throws out a single big bat that goes towards enemies and kind of oscillates, almost kind of a serpentine pattern, left to right, and does damage to a large group of guys just in clusters or whatever. So it's kind of like a line damage ability, almost a cone, just a really long, kind of thinnish cone, and it can damage large crowds of enemies. So generally you're going to use this against single targets or just bigger enemies or smaller groups. And then if you have a particularly large pack, you can use a few Dire Bats. Now it is fairly expensive, it's 122 mana, but with just a modicum of mana regen in Inferno, you can really get past that without really having much trouble. But if you do have trouble, you can spec Soul Harvest for Swallow Your Soul to get mana back and allow you to use Dire Bats more frequently. Soul Harvest is pretty much mandatory for every Witch Doctor build. It is a huge, huge increase in damage. It will always double your damage, basically. Throughout my entire Witch Doctor's career, whenever I got a 5-stack on it, it would double my damage. So not using this ability is severely gimping your power and your damage, and making you far less effective than you would need to be. There are situations in the game that you might be cruising through so quickly that it doesn't really matter because it'll just be in the realm of overkill anyway, which is understandable, but against bosses that have trash, that have ads you can buff up against, or basically anything in Inferno, because Inferno, you're not going to be doing overkill until you're very well geared. You should be using this at all times. So you can use Swallow Your Soul if you'd like more mana for Fire Bats, but I would personally recommend either Siphon, to use it as another defensive cooldown, get mana back. It makes it a little safer also to use it in Inferno, because you do need to run into point-blank range anyway. Language is not a good option. Soul to Waste I would only use if you have a very hard time keeping it up, because it's unsafe or because you just forget or what have you. It makes it last a minute. Languish, the slow is too short and there are better slows in the class. Don't recommend it. I personally like to use Vengeful Spirit to debuff enemies and make them take an additional 70% weapon damage as physical. And I believe that extends to your party members as well. I believe it's a debuff on the enemy, so your party members should also benefit, kind of like Marked for Death, the Demon Hunter ability. Not totally sure on that, but even if it doesn't, very useful for the Witch Doctor themselves, and for just increasing the damage of your Templar maybe, or your Gargantuan, or whatever. So, Soul Harvest, and then another mandatory ability for basically all builds once it's unlocked. Spirit Walk. Spirit Walk allows you to move quickly, just in non-combat situations. It allows you to phase out of reality. So say you're completely surrounded by a group. Say I was completely surrounded by a group here. I could use it, run to the other side of the room, and then start attacking them without any trouble. You can use it to dodge powerful abilities, or juke, if you like to use a MOBA term, just avoid abilities because it gives you invulnerability, so I could use it against Belial's ground pounds or his explosions. I could use it against Diablo. I could use it to break out of stuns and CC effects like jailer effects. If somebody vortexes me, I can run away. I can use it to break out of being frozen. It has almost infinite uses. It's an incredibly useful survivability tool. Even for just uptime, say you're being attacked and you just can't attack a guy and you know you could kill him in just a couple of seconds. Well, let him run up to you and pop this. I'm invulnerable for 2 seconds. I can get some shots off, hopefully kill him. Very useful on abilities that can do a tremendous amount of burst, like zombie bears, like the explosion for the chicken bomber build, stuff like that. So, Spirit Walk, personally, I prefer it to be spec'd with Healing Journey. I think that is the best option for Inferno. Leveling up, you can use Jaunt to make it last longer. You can use Honored Guest to help you get back mana for dire bat spam. Umbral Shock is not really congruent to this build, nor is Severance. Severance seems kind of suicidal. Healing Journey allows you to get back 14% of your maximum health over 2 seconds, which is very, very useful for survivability. Now, this ability is really optional. I prefer using Hex with Hedge Magic to give me another survivability cooldown. You could also use the various other runes for Hex if you would like. They all have their own pros and cons. Jinx lets you do more damage to an individual target. Angry Chicken can be used as a defensive cooldown and knock enemies away, and for some additional PB AoE damage. Painful Transformation can be used to bleed a target if, say, you can't really attack them for whatever reason after they've been jinxed, so you don't get that additional damage. This will allow you to damage them without even attacking them. And then Unstable Form lets you do a bit of AoE damage, though I should stress that 8 yards is an extremely small radius, so it won't really be affecting many enemies at any given time. Now, other than that, you could use, say, Horrify for a panic button on just a 20-second cooldown, and then get 8 seconds of 100% additional armor, which is quite significant. For me, that's another 20% damage reduction, so that's definitely something worth thinking about. Oops. In addition to that, let's see our other options. I would not bother with Mass Confusion. Its cooldown is simply too long for this build. Not really that useful. Even if you shorten it with one of the runes, I still would not recommend it. Kind of dangerous to use as well because it's a PB AoE. Other than that, Wall of Zombies and Pile On, a lot of players love it. Personally, I'm not a big fan. Yes, it's a neat party trick when you're in a group, and everybody's jealous of your 100,000k crit, or more when you're actually geared in Inferno. I can already crit with it for like 80,000, and I'm not even in very good gear, so it has one of the, if not the, highest weapon damage modifier in the game, but you can only use it once every 25 seconds. And just to show you, it has a really narrow cone and a very long delay until it actually falls. You have to wait for it to actually, for them to turn into the tower, then you would need to wait for almost a second for them just to fall over. So any sort of unique or champion will more than likely get out of the way before that, unless you bother slowing them or you have some way to route them or what have you, which would be a different build entirely if you wanted to actually build around Pile On. But it's hard to do so because it's such a long cooldown that you can't use it in every fight, and you can't use it consistently, really, and most enemies will just move out of the way, barring some sort of crowd control. So I don't recommend Pile On, but feel free to use it if you like it. Fetish Army is an interesting choice, just for more uptime. It is kind of ironic that I will not be using Headhunters in a build called Headhunter, but personally, I would use Fetish Ambush for a huge burst of damage in PBAOE. It can do a ton of damage because it does 250% weapon damage per Fetish as they stream in. I would not really recommend any of the other ones. Maybe Devoted Following if you just would like to use Fetish Army for more uptime, or possibly Headhunters for more damage. The two Hunter Fetishes it gives you have nice uptime because they're ranged, so they can do some decent enough damage fairly quickly. But probably Fetish Ambush or Devoted Following would be your best bet if you like to use Fetish Army. Would not recommend Big Bad Voodoo, really not necessary for this build. Grasp of the Dead can be nice just for a slow. Can't really argue with just a slow every few seconds for survivability. I wouldn't use Haunt, it's too mana intensive for this build, even with Draining Spirit. You need to sacrifice a passive to use Rush of Essence, really, to make it manageable, unless you have a lot of mana regen through Witch Doctor gear. So I think that is about... And same goes for Locust Swarm. Very mana intensive. I think that's about it. One thing I did not talk about. Zombie dogs. I would love to use zombie dogs in this build. I would love to be an even more pet-focused build. But just like the Druid in Diablo 2, by late hell, you really couldn't use your wolves anymore. They just died way too quickly. You had to stick with the bear. It's much the same in this game. By Inferno, by Hell, even Nightmare, and in some parts of Normal, the dogs just die way too quickly. to be useful beyond just sacrificing them for bonus damage, but you do not have enough slots to use zombie dogs and sacrifice in this build, and I don't think it's worthwhile at all, really. And I do not think you'll ever have enough health regen through Fierce Loyalty to really get the zombie dogs to be survivable. I do not know what their base health actually is, and on Inferno, they might very well just get one-shot by a lot of enemies anyway before their health regen can actually kick in. But if it's possible, maybe it will be someday, but I certainly do not have the gear to back it up. So I can't really say either way definitively. But my personal choice is Hex with Hedge Magic for more healing. You cast him, he casts chickens, and he will periodically heal you, which is very nice for survivability. And finally, one of the keystones of the build, Gargantuan. The point of Gargantuan is to use him more as a means of distraction, to help you get uptime, to tank packs, to tank champions and uniques as best as possible. And even with a modicum of health regen, I really have gotten him to the point that he can do that decently well. I prefer Gargantuan with Big Stinker. Big Stinker making him do a PBAOE, just kind of pulsing poison damage to enemies around him, which can actually really add up over time. Humungoid I don't think is really useful throughout the game once you get Restless Giant. Restless Giant, when just looking at it, you might think it's not very good because you can only use it once every 2 minutes. However, I really actually liked Restless Giant. It makes him very, very powerful in bursts, and generally speaking, certainly on Hell and Inferno, you won't really encounter a champion or unique pack more than once a minute or so anyway. And while it does have a 2-minute cooldown, if the cooldown on the Gargantuan itself is up when he blows his Enrage, and after the Enrage, you can simply summon him immediately thereafter and he'll use it again. So you can use it twice in quick succession, and really once a minute, even though it says once every 120 seconds. As long as you just haven't summoned him in that time, you can use the Enrage once a minute, just on demand. So personally, I like that evolution myself, that rune, I should say. Wrathful Protector, I'm not a fan of for this build. You really should only use Wrathful Protector in situations where your Gargantuan would just instantly die anyway, just for a quick distraction. But if that's the case and he's dying that quickly, you really shouldn't be using this build because you do not have enough health regeneration to keep him up. I like Big Stinker for the reasons I mentioned, but another good option is Bruiser. It makes him very similar to the Bear in Diablo 2. Makes him stun enemies and knock them back. Really increases his damage, can be quite useful, though a very late game unlock. And the reason that I like Big Stinker is I like to use it with Bad Medicine to give him to just basically reduce all enemies around him, all their damage reduction, or rather all their damage by 20%. It essentially gives you 20% damage reduction once you have him out with his pulsing Poison Aura. That also, with Poison Dart, helps keep Bad Medicine up. Poison Dart especially against bosses or champions or what have you. So for the passives that I like are Jungle Fortitude. I really can't recommend using anything but Jungle Fortitude for your first passive. 20% damage reduction is incredibly powerful. It's essentially 1,000 armor. I have 2,000 armor and about 40% damage reduction. This is not taken into consideration on the character sheet. If I spec out of Jungle Fortitude, it will still say that I have 42% or so damage reduction. So with this, I have 60% damage reduction. Very, very, very powerful. And I don't think I'm even using a shield. I'm not using a shield, so even more so. In addition to that, Bad Medicine for the reasons I mentioned along with Big Stinker. However, this build really would benefit from Pierce the Veil. All damage increased by 20%, but mana cost increased by 30%. Even with those 30% increased mana cost, you can spam Poison Dart ad infinitum, and it's really not a problem. And the 20% damage increase is incredibly significant. So if you did not want to use, say, Big Stinker on the Gargantuan and you wanted to use Bruiser, I say go for it, and don't go with Bad Medicine, and instead go with Pierce the Veil. But for this demonstration, I'm going to go with Bad Medicine. And of course, the other keystone of the build along with Gargantuan is just Fierce Loyalty, making him inherit 100% of my Thorns and Life Regeneration items. That regeneration allows him to stay up a lot better than without, to the point that he's actually a pretty decent tank even in early Inferno, and certainly in Hell. Very, very powerful, and I just have a bit, maybe 200 or so health per second regen. I could have a lot more than that. Now, you don't want to sacrifice so many stats as well, so many offensive stats that you can no longer kill things, but health regen is very powerful in this game, and I really don't think you could go wrong stacking 1,000 of it even. 1,000 health per second is pretty freaking ridiculous. I mean, that's some massive survivability, as long as you have enough damage reduction and just base health that you can survive getting one shot. So I think that this is definitely a viable build, and a build that will scale very, very well with gear. But I wouldn't really recommend anything else other than Fierce Loyalty for this build. I would not recommend... Oh, and by the way, Jungle Fortitude also extends to the Gargantuan, so keep that in mind. Very useful for that respect. I would really like to take some other stuff as well. I would love to take Zombie Handler, just to give my Gargantuan another 20% health, which would be nice, but at the end of the day, testing both of them, Fierce Loyalty is way better for survivability than Zombie Handler, and I'm not actually using the dogs anyway. Maybe one day if I'm actually using the dogs, I have enough gear to support them. Maybe it could work. Don't really know. I would love to use Fetish Sycophants as well, as these little guys are nice distractions, and you can get a lot of them running around, say 4 or so at any given time, if not more, with spamming Poison Dart. You can summon a lot of these things, even with just a 3% chance to summon. If you're using something spammable like Poison Dart, or Plague of Toads even, Firebomb, just everything it mentions. Not really Wall of Zombies, that has too long a cooldown, and the other stuff that doesn't really make sense, but stuff that you can spam, you can get a lot of them out, but don't have enough room for it. I would also love Spirit Vessel, just for the cheat death mechanic. Saves you once every minute and a half, and to reduce the cooldown on Spirit Walk more than anything else even. Very nice to have it down to 13 seconds, especially on certain boss encounters to maximize the healing and your uptime and your avoidance and what have you. But this is what I'm going to use. And I think I can now actually demonstrate it. That was quite the long spiel. So, Poison Dart with Splinters, Fire Bats with Dire Bats, Soul Harvest with Vengeful Spirit, Spirit Walk with Healing Journey, Hex with Hedge Magic, and the Gargantuan with Big Stinker. And I highly recommend using a Templar for this build if you are soloing to give you loyalty, 155 life per second. I believe that extends over to the Gargantuan. It might not, I don't know for sure, but it is health regen, and he should inherit 100% of my health regen, and this would be my health regen, so it should extend to him. Not totally sure. Even without that, though, the Templar is an excellent choice for survivability. This is how I spec mine. Heal, loyalty, charge, and Guardian to save me. Alright, let us demonstrate it. So this build is rather simple. You just summon your Gargantuan, make sure he's out, start up the cooldown. That's a Treasure Goblin and a Molten Pack, and I'm not even going to bother, because that's madness. So let's actually go find some regular guys. This build can handle actual champions and what have you, but you really need the gear and Inferno to support it. So we have a large group of guys here. I'm going to buff up. I'm going to send out some Dire Bats, and then finish everybody off with my Splinters. I should be using Hex just on cooldown, making sure he's out at all times to make my life easier. And it's a simple build. It's similar to the Hunter in the previous game. Just let your pet tank for you and just kind of shoot everybody dead, and actually has a lot more flexibility because you actually have survivability cooldowns, and AoE, it's kind of a lot better, but that's just the way the games have evolved. So another 2 guys, buff up, get out my Fetish, send out Fire Bats, Dire Bats rather, every so often. Make sure that I don't let this thing blow up on me. There's a huge radius. And my Gargantuan is still alive, you'll notice. He survived both of those big explosions. He survived guys hitting him. Fierce Loyalty really dramatically increases his survivability. So let's just find maybe 1 or 2 more packs and finish this off. I also personally love how he looks when he has Big Stinker. That's probably just me. Okay, another huge pack. So I'm actually going to use my Spirit Walk to get into the pack, then send out a bunch of Dire Bats. Get out my Fetish. Wait for a little mana to come back, and then just finish everybody off, once again, with my Poison Darts. And my Gargantuan did die, but who cares? He's off cooldown. He lasted minutes rather than seconds, and that is the objective of the build, and he'll only last longer as I get more health regen and better gear. So we do need to try to kill the witches, though, because they're going to just infinitely spawn zombies. Let's buff up. And that's basically it. That was a huge pack. I think that demonstrates it well enough. Finish these guys off. Get out my Fetish. Really standard stuff. Couple of Dire Bats. That's it. That's it, guys. That is the Headhunter build. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, if you thought it was educational and it helped you. Please sub if you'd like to see more of this stuff, more Diablo 3. Leave comments and feedback, ask questions, I'll answer them, and have a good one.
I would take my own life before becoming one of these fiends.